I'm always encouraged when I see people who are willing to take the time and come and listen and participate in a conversation about this issue, particularly here in the United States, for two reasons. First of all, America gives more money to Israel than any other country and any other place in the world, so we all need to know more about this. And the other reason is because as I go from city to city to place, and other speakers do the same thing, we're noticing that there are more and more people who are actually getting involved and getting engaged with this issue, and that's exactly what is needed in order to bring about change. And that is also the reason why I am very optimistic. I wouldn't be speaking about this, I wouldn't be traveling around the country and around the world if I wasn't completely confident that a solution, and a good solution, is upon us. And hopefully by the end of my presentation, you'll know what I mean by that. You may have heard that just recently, Israel and the United States agreed on a foreign aid package. You may have heard that Israel demanded $45 billion over the next 10 years, and they compromised on $38 billion over the next 10 years, which is a little bit of an increase from the previous decade. The previous decade, they got $35 billion. So I think that's something that's important to keep in the back of our minds, because it means that nobody in the United States can claim to be impartial to this issue. Because if we do nothing and say nothing, we are still supporting one side. So if you're well informed and you agree, that's one thing, that's fine. If you're well informed and you disagree, then you need to do something. Because by doing nothing, we are supporting the state of Israel. So if you disagree, it's important to act, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as well in my presentation. Now, just to kind of I think Pat kind of cautioned you, but I'll caution you again. My presentation is completely unbalanced. My presentation is completely one-sided. And the reason I put it out there in the beginning is because people like to come at the end and say, hey, but this is not fair, you are not balanced. Well, this is not a balanced reality. This is not a balanced situation. There is no balance here, and there is no balanced presentation that's possible. Everybody's got their take, and mine is very clear and very decidedly on one side. If you take, and this is probably why, if you take a look at the United Nations definition of genocide, and you put it next to what has happened in Palestine over the last 70 years, you will see that they are almost identical. What Israel has done in Palestine over the last 7 decades is almost completely identical to the United Nations definition of genocide. So Israel is, or should be charged, but is definitely guilty of genocide. If you look at the next article, you will see that America is complicit in genocide by giving all these billions and billions of dollars and selling weapons to a country that commits genocide. And I think it's very important that we all have this in the back of our minds as we look at this issue, because genocide is a very serious thing. And as we are all contributors as taxpayers, like I said, if we don't actively oppose what is happening, then we are complicit by our inaction. So again, I think it's important to keep all of this in mind as we move forward. Now, when we look at the United States and the history of the United States, we see genocide, we see slavery, we see a reality today where black lives don't matter, and brown lives, by the way, don't matter either, as it happens. Then this massive support for genocide in Palestine actually makes sense, because the two countries share an ideology. And this might sound severe, but again, it's important for us to take a rational and clear view of why there is this connection between these two countries, and why Americans feel completely comfortable in giving so much money to the state of Israel. Another interesting thing is the way we define, the way we talk about what is happening in Palestine. Some people call it a conflict. Some people call it an occupation. Some people call it a dispute. And a friend of mine from Norway said to me once, if anybody suggested that the German occupation of Norway was a dispute or a conflict, they would be thrown out the window, and rightfully so. But somehow when it comes to Palestine, people like to call it a conflict, a dispute. They seem to be kind of, to pick and choose how to define it. And it's important that in our minds and in the way we express it, we are as clear as possible. Now, here's a question that I like to ask. Is Palestine one country or two? By the way, is anybody here from Israel or Palestine? Has anybody visited? Anybody been there? Okay, a few people. Okay, can everybody find it on a map if they had to? All right. Because it's a very, well, that's that makes it look big, but it's actually very hard to find on a map because it's so small. When you look at the map, you always notice that the name of the country, whether you call it Israel or Palestine, is never on it because it's too small, so the name is always kind of covering Cyprus. But it's a very small place that's getting a lot of money. So people say, well, Israel, Palestine. I've been to Israel, I've been to Palestine. I did this in Israel, I did that in Palestine. This happened in Israel, this happened in Palestine. It sounds almost like there are two countries, but is it one country or two? I think it's important to determine. And I think it's absolutely clear that Israel and Palestine are two names for the same place. It is one country. Depending on what your politics and where you come from, you either call it Israel or Palestine. But it is the same place, and there are two people living there, Israelis and Palestinians, which is why sometimes it's confusing. And Israelis and Palestinians live over the entire country, and even though the societies and the communities are deeply segregated, they are very close geographically, and they live everywhere. And the other question is, how do we define the reality in Palestine? Is it a war between two countries? Because if it's a war between two countries, then that's one thing. That should lead us to ending it and concluding it a certain way. However, if it's a struggle for freedom and justice, then it's an entirely different story. Peace talks are not the right thing. And as I'm sure you know, peace talks have been going on for a couple of decades now, and they're leading nowhere. And I would argue that they're leading nowhere because they are the wrong solution to this issue. Peace talks is not how you deal with occupation and oppression. The way you deal with occupation and oppression is through resistance. So unless we have all of these facts clear in our mind, there's no way that we can understand how we move forward, which is why I ask these questions. Now, another thing that I think is very troubling with this issue is the way it is portrayed. There's never any context. So suddenly Israel's invading Gaza. Suddenly Palestinians are stabbing soldiers or shooting rockets from Gaza, there's never a clear narrative, if you will. And there's, like I said, there's never context. And I think the reason that is done this way is to keep people confused. So that the answer to the question, what do we do with this issue, will always be, well, it's complicated. And it's been going on forever. And if it's complicated and it's been going on forever, there's nothing simple folks like us can possibly do because we can't understand it. And so we just leave it alone. We give the aid package, the congressmen get the vote for the aid package, get reelected, and everybody's fine with it. And I think that's a very dangerous reality. So we need to change. And what I'm going to try to do this afternoon is create some context so that we have an idea of how and when this conflict began and why, where we stand today, and then if we seek to find a just solution, where we go from here and what it will require. So I'm going to give you, go through a little bit of a history lesson. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these facts. I'll go through them anyway, just so we do have the context. So you may have heard of this thing called the Balfour Declaration. And Lord Balfour was a foreign secretary of Great Britain, and he wrote a note that he gave to a Jewish millionaire friend of his by the name of Rothschild, saying that Her Majesty, or His Majesty's government, the British government, supports the idea of establishing a homeland for Jewish people in Palestine. And neither one of these men lived in Palestine or had anything to do with Palestine, but those were days where colonialism worked that way. White people could take brown people's land and do with it as they will, and that's exactly what it was. you could define it by saying one white racist promising another white racist a country that belongs to somebody else. And that's exactly what the Balfour Declaration is. In Israel, every city has a Balfour Street. When you talk about Balfour, you'd think he was a prophet and that the Balfour Declaration was one of the 10 Commandments. That is just how, people talk, well, the Balfour Declaration, that's it. It's God's word or something, Basically, that's what it was. Two racists talking about a country that belonged to neither one of them, belonged to somebody else. And then several decades later, the United Nations decided to intervene, and they came up with this thing called the Partition Plan. It's called the Partition, by the way, of Palestine. And when you look at the map, this is the Partition Plan. There is no way that the person who drew this map was sober, because no one sober could come up with such a ridiculous map. Not only is it an absurd map, in other words, not only can you not have two states that look like this, but there's something even more troubling about this map. As you can see clearly, there's one portion larger than the other. Now, in 1947, there were only about 500,000 Jews in Palestine, and the vast majority were the generation of my grandparents who came there to colonize, if you will, or to immigrate, and the generation of my parents who were first-born, Sabra Israelis. Basically a community who just came off the boat. The Palestinian community was far larger. It was about 3 times larger than that. But in this partition plan, the larger portion is allocated for the smaller Jewish community. And the smaller portion was supposed to be an Arab Palestinian state, even though the Palestinians were the larger population, and of course this was Palestine and this is their land. And even today we hear people say, well, the reason there's a conflict is because the Palestinians rejected the partition plan. And you have to scratch your head and say, of course they rejected the partition plan. How would they not reject a plan that gives the vast majority of their country to these European colonizers who just came off the boat? How does this even make sense? Not, of course, that they were asked. Then, another important aspect of this particular time in history is that from that moment on, we see two narratives emerge, two histories that are diametrically opposed. So when I say diametrically opposed, I mean diametrically opposed. It's not like they differ in a nuance or a detail here and there. We have two histories, two narratives that emerge from that moment on, which are completely the opposite of each other. Which means if we accept one, we reject the other. There is no room, there is no gray area, there is no way to bridge the two. The one narrative is the narrative that I grew up with, and most Americans grew up with, which is this narrative of the Israelis, the Zionist narrative, which says that this was a story of heroism and revival. The small Jewish community was attacked by the Arabs. Because we were smarter and more advanced and fast on our feet, we defeated these Arabs and we conquered the country and established a Jewish state in the ancient land of Israel once again after 2,000 years. Now again, this is so powerful, so romantic and heroic, it's almost biblical. It's like a new chapter in the Bible. Then we have the Palestinian narrative, which talks about occupation, terrorism, and ethnic cleansing. Now, go bridge that gap. That understanding the differences, understanding these two narratives is key to understanding the conflict. Unless we come to terms with the fact that these two narratives are the way they are, we can never move forward. This is key. This is one of the pillars of the conflict. Now, what's interesting is this. About 15 years ago or so, several Israeli historians took a look at the Israeli narrative, took a very close look, and they found many holes in that narrative. You may have heard of Ilan Pape. He's the chief historian. He's the main historian of that group. And he's written the epic history book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And what these Ilan and some of these other historians came to realize is that the Palestinian narrative is true. That the Israeli narrative is a myth and the Palestinian narrative is true. Basically, they were validating what the Palestinians have been saying for decades. Okay? But in the West, we can't believe the Palestinians because they're brown and they're Arabs. However, when an Israeli historian of German background comes up and says something, then we take notice. And that's exactly what happened. People started talking about this only after Ilan Pappé and these others wrote the book. Now, particularly, a particularly interesting point that they raise is the following. By 1947, the Jewish community in Palestine had developed a very strong, well-trained, and well-armed militia. That militia became the Israeli army shortly after that. My father was an officer in that militia. On the Palestinian side, there was no militia. There was no armed force. There was no army. In fact, there's never been a Palestinian army. So in the claim that the Palestinians attacked the Jewish community, you have to say, well, if there was no militia, if there was no armed force, who attacked the Jewish community and with what? And then the deeper we dig, the deeper we go, the more we realize there was no attack by the Arabs of the Jewish community. It was the other way around. It was the other way around. And very shortly, by December of 1947, very shortly after the partition resolution, there were already Palestinian towns and cities being destroyed. Tens of thousands of Palestinians were forced into exile. This lasted a whole year. By the end of that year, almost 1 million Palestinians were forced into exile. Hundreds and hundreds of towns and cities were completely destroyed, wiped off the map. And the state of Israel was established on the ashes of what was Palestine. So, like I said, go bridge this gap. At the end of that war, by the beginning of 1949, this is what the map looked like. Israel had occupied almost all of Palestine, with the exception of two areas. The West Bank, or the area that became called is the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Now, there's nothing natural about those areas. There's nothing natural. It's not like you go there and you see, okay, now I know why the map is like this. It was drawn at random. It was drawn by Israelis who said, this is how we want the map to be. The reason they didn't take the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was because of internal Israeli politics. They decided to stop the fighting, to stop the ethnic cleansing, and just establish themselves on what's about 80% of the country. This was at the end, or that was the end of that period of 1948, and this lasted about 20 years. Now, there's a story in my book that I'm going to share with you. It's a story about my mother. This is a picture of her when she was young. She was born and raised in Jerusalem. She still lives in Jerusalem. She just turned 90. And and this is a story that she told me my entire life. I don't know when the first time I heard the story, but I have heard it my entire life, and we still talk about it today. And this is an experience that she had as a young mother. She was about 22 in Jerusalem in 1948. Now, when I say Jerusalem, I'm talking about the side of Jerusalem which became Israel, not the old city of Jerusalem. And the Jewish militia, what became the Israeli army, took the Palestinian neighborhoods, forced the Palestinians to leave, and these very beautiful, very distinct homes, if you've been to Jerusalem, you may have seen them, very distinct homes, very distinct neighborhoods, were offered to Israeli families. Now, my mother was, at the time, she was a young mother. She was living in a small apartment with her parents. My father was out in the front fighting for the cause, and she was offered one of these homes, as were many Israeli families. And at age 22, she made the decision not to take it. And her response was, and still is today, and she says it with the same passion, how could I possibly take the home of another mother? How could I possibly take the home of a family that now is forced to live in exile? Now, it's a pretty brave thing when you're 22 to refuse a beautiful home, which is basically for free. And of course, we're all very proud of the fact that she made that decision. But growing up and hearing this story, there was something very troubling for me. Growing up, as an Israeli kid, going to Israeli school, there was something very, very troubling. And I wasn't really able to pinpoint and to understand why it was troubling until I was working on the book. At that point, and having spoken to my mother many, many times and heard the story and over again, I realized that her story was contradicting the national narrative. It was contradicting that story of heroism and revival. Because we are the good guys. This is our land. We were exiled some 2,000-3,000 years ago due to no fault of our own, and now 2,000 years later we're back to take to claim what's legally and rightfully ours. Because we are good, reasonable people, we agreed to the partition plan. Even though it didn't give us the entire country, but we're reasonable people, and the Arabs rejected and attacked us. Okay, you're following the narrative here. Okay, this is our narrative. Then we defeated the Arabs, of course, because we are better than they are. And then we asked them to stay, and they left. We asked the Arabs to stay, and they got up and left. And this is the part of the story where you have to scratch your head and you say, we asked them to stay and they left? I mean, were there buses? Were they taken to a resort? I mean, how exactly did it work that they just left? Homes that were there for generations. So where's the moral dilemma? Why did she refuse the home? Because according to the story, according to the narrative, there is no moral dilemma. Everything we did was fine. If somebody leaves their home, they don't want it, and there's a family that needs a home, there is no moral dilemma here. She was presenting a moral dilemma. And then she would go on to describe that when these early soldiers came into these homes and started to loot them and take the rugs and the furniture and the books and everything else, the coffee was still warm on the table. The families had just left. Which again is very moving. It's a very powerful story. But again, like I said, it didn't make sense. And what I realized today, having published the book and spoken and thought about it a lot, the Israeli narrative always maintains the moral high ground. We are always doing things right. We always find a way to justify what we've done. 2014, massive bombardment of innocent people, murdering thousands in Gaza. But it's okay, because Hamas is in Gaza. And Hamas, as we know, is the devil, so it's okay to murder all these people. It's okay to attack and kill indiscriminately. The Israelis always have a way of maintaining the moral high ground, regardless of what they do. And of course, the magic trick is that they're able to convince the rest of the world, or at least the West. So I think it's important to kind of sum it up a little bit, this little history lesson. In 1948, Israel occupied the majority of Palestine. And this is important to say it this way, because a lot of people will say, well, the occupation of Palestine began in 1967. Or the occupied Palestinian territories of 1967, which are those two little areas, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In 1967, Israel took those in the war that's called the Six-Day War. Okay? So, what happened in 1967 was not the beginning of an occupation, it was the completion of the occupation. In 1967, Israel completed the occupation of Palestine, or what we call the Land of Israel. And the generals of that war, of the 1967 war, among whom my father was a member, the Israeli High Command, congratulated themselves for finishing the job. They said, these are the words that they used, that they finished the job. The job of 1948, that was not completed in 48, but the job of reclaiming what is rightfully ours. And of course, the West Bank contains like the heartland, East Jerusalem and Hebron and all these biblical cities, or cities that we have about which we have biblical stories. And basically what that allowed Israel to do is to finalize the establishment of a single state with exclusive rights for Jewish people in Palestine, which of course we know as Israel. I don't accept that Israel is somehow a Jewish state. There's nothing Jewish about it, except for the fact that it offers exclusive rights for Jewish people at the expense of the Palestinians. Now, basically what Israel has done since is erased Palestine off the map completely, at least in their own mind. So when you look at Israeli maps, school maps, weather maps, geography maps, travel guides, whatever you look at, you see the entire country and not a single mention of a single Palestinian entity, not a single Palestinian city. There is no Palestine and there are no Palestinians. Which of course is another magic trick, because the majority of the population are Palestinians. Out of 12 million people who live there, about 6.2 million are Palestinians. So Palestinians are the majority. Of course, they live an entirely different life and under entirely different laws than Jews like myself do. So this is kind of a summation of the occupation. And I think it's very important to remember that The occupation did not start in 1967, it was completed in 1967. All of Palestine is occupied. All Israeli cities are settlements, illegal settlements. Not only the settlements in East Jerusalem or the West Bank, the entire country, every Israeli city and town is an illegal settlement built on stolen Palestinian land. And another important little point is the water. Israel has its own central water authority, which takes all the water and then distributes it. Palestinians, who are the majority, are allocated 3% of the water. So you will have, and if you've been there, you've seen this, you have an Israeli town with green lawns and swimming pools, and you wouldn't dream as an Israeli not to have water in the tap or take a shower or anything like that, of course. Across the street, you have a Palestinian town that has 12 hours of water per week. Per week. And this is the reality, and they call this the Jewish state. So I think, again, this is very important to kind of internalize. Now, you cannot talk about Palestine without mentioning Gaza. Of course, we mentioned Gaza in the introduction and in my talk, in just the last few minutes I've been speaking. So the Gaza Strip, people talk about it as though, again, there's something there that's natural. There's some strip that's there, that's always been there. The Gaza Strip is a line that was drawn by Israel around the city of Gaza in the early 1950s as a place into which they could herd the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees who were the victims of the ethnic cleansing. You've got hundreds of thousands of people, you've got to take them somewhere. So many of them left and went, if they were in the north, they went to Lebanon and other places, but this is the southern part of the country. They were herded into refugee camps, and a line was drawn. This is the Gaza Strip, and that's where they were. And the majority of the people in the Gaza Strip, even today, of course, are either refugees or their descendants. Now, it's a very small place, as you can see, 140 square miles. The vast majority of the population are under 18, so they're children. 80% food insecure is what how the United Nations describes it, which means that people don't know when their next meal is going to be available. It's one step before hunger. 90% of the water is not fit for drinking. And all of this, and of course electricity, forget regular supply of electricity. It's one day they have electricity, the next day they don't. They go in all these different shifts because it's all controlled by Israel. And all of this is taking place 5 minutes away from Israeli cities where people live like we do here. You wouldn't dream of not having electricity, clean water, access to medicine, In Gaza, if a child has an ear infection, there is no access to antibiotics. Can you imagine? An ear infection and there's no access to antibiotics. Little things. Never mind the bombing. Never mind the tens of thousands of people who are injured as a result of the bombing and have no access to health care because Israel bombed the hospitals and won't allow them to go into the medical facilities 5 minutes away inside of Israel. The United Nations said in a report that by 2020 there will be a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. Whoever wrote that report needs to go to Gaza and tell me that there's not a humanitarian catastrophe right now. I want to hear them say that there's not a humanitarian catastrophe going on there right now. And this is 5 minutes away from Israeli cities where people live a life of, a perfectly industrial, rich nation, industrialized and free nation. Now, another piece of this data which is stunning is the literacy rate in Gaza. Gaza has a literacy rate of 92%, which is higher than what we have here in America. Now, it doesn't make sense because usually when you have poverty and unemployment, you have low literacy. How is it they have such a high literacy rate, yet poverty and unemployment? It doesn't make sense. This has been imposed on them because of the closure, because of Israel. And all of this is connected to the ethnic cleansing in 1948. There would be no Gaza Strip, there would be no refugees, there would be no poverty, there would be no unemployment, certainly not these levels, had it not been for the ethnic cleansing in 1948, which again is the context. Now, another interesting aspect of Gaza is that as soon as the Gaza Strip was established, Israel began attacking. The Gaza Strip was actually finalized and established in the early 1950s, and by 1953, 1952, 1953, Israel already began sending commandos, special commandos, into Gaza to fight and kill and destroy. Now, remember, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of poor, homeless refugees. There's never been a tank in Gaza. There's never been a fighter plane in Gaza. There's never been a regular army in Gaza. Yet Israel had put together a special commando unit, which was led by Ariel Sharon, who later on he's known as the Butcher. He was later on Israel's prime minister. And they would go in, commit terrible massacres, or what they call punitive operations. But the punishment was for what? Punitive for what? Well, they called them infiltrators. There's a problem of infiltrators. And you have to wonder, infiltrators, that sounds kind of suspicious. What were they doing, these infiltrators? Well, the majority were people trying to go back to their homes, trying to go back to their land, trying to bring food. Some of them were coming in order to conduct acts of armed resistance with weapons, whatever little weapons they had. These pictures are actually that unit coming out victorious. Of course, victorious of what? They didn't fight anybody because there's nobody there to fight, but they murdered many people. And that's Ariel Sharon in that picture over there on the end as a young man. Of course, today, the technology has improved, so they can kill a lot more people and much, much faster. If in those days they would kill dozens or hundreds, in 2014, I think they killed the first 500 people in the first 2-3 minutes, which is quite remarkable. They had 6,000 flyovers dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on a civilian population that has no defense and, of course, no weapons really to speak of. And that was in preparation for the ground invasion. Israel called up 40,000 reservists for the ground invasion after all these 6,000 flyovers. And you have to wonder, who are they fighting? What were they doing? There has never been a military threat. There is no military threat to Israel from Gaza, and this is what it looks like. 2 of these pictures I took myself in Gaza. And the one thing that is, again, an unbelievable magic trick, how is it that nobody asks the simple question of why? Why is Israel murdering people in Gaza, attacking Gaza for 7 decades? We heard about Cast Lead, which is 2008, 2009. This began in the 1950s. It's been going on for 7 decades. How is it nobody's asking why? When these things take place, all we hear is Israel has a right to defend itself. It's self-defense. Now, there's never been a military threat to Israel from Gaza. Anybody who knows anything about this issue knows that this is nonsense. There is no military threat. There hasn't been a military threat. Why is it that Israel is killing so many people, and how is it that the world is allowing this to happen? How is it that everybody is eating up this nonsense of self-defense? How is it that all of us sitting here are allowing the American government to give Israel billions of dollars to do this, and the weapons to do this, and nobody's being held accountable? And we go on about our business. And like I said in the beginning, we are all complicit unless we stand clearly against it. So if there's never been a military threat, why? The existence of the Gaza Strip, the existence of this humanitarian catastrophe that is man-made, made by Israel, 5 minutes away from Israeli towns and cities where people live like this, like we do here, is a threat to the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And the legitimacy is everything. The legitimacy is everything. It's the Holy Grail. Israel will kill and destroy and do anything it takes in order to make sure that the legitimacy is maintained. The narrative that we have a right, the narrative that this is our land, the narrative that we are always maintaining the moral high ground. That is why. Because allowing things to just remain the way they are is not a possibility. People are going to ask questions. So there are 2 options. One option is to take the $30 billion, pay restitution, allow the refugees to return, rebuild Gaza. But Israel doesn't want that. They got rid of all these Arabs, not to allow them to come back in. So the only other option is to kill them and blame them for being terrorists. And it works like magic. Every talking head, every politician, every news network here in Europe was saying repeating the exact same nonsense about Israel's right to defend itself. And again, the question is, defend itself against what? There is no military threat. There hasn't been a military threat. And that is the question that we need to ask, and this is the thing that we need to demand people talk about. For 7 decades, Israel has been conducting these horrific crimes with our money, with American money, and with American weapons, and with American consent. Now, I tried to get into Gaza several times and failed. As an Israeli, I can't go through Israel because Israeli law prohibits Israelis from going into Palestinian territories. So the West Bank is easy because it's porous. So it's easy to get in and out even though it's not prohibited, even though it's prohibited. Gaza is a prison, it's completely closed. So there's no way to get in. So I tried to go in, there's a small part of Gaza that has a border with Egypt. So I tried to go through Egypt, but the Egyptians and the Israelis are collaborating on this monstrous siege and these attacks on Gaza. So the Egyptians, I couldn't get in through Egypt either. And I've tried many times. I actually gone there and sent back. So then at one point, a few years ago, I got a message from a friend on Facebook asking me if I would consider coming in by subway. That's exactly the direction I had, by subway. There is no subway system in Gaza. Well, Gaza used to have on a very short stretch of land on the Egyptian border that they had about 1,000 tunnels. And that is how they brought in food and water and medicine and everything else that you need to survive. Cash and everything went in through the tunnels. And so this is the tunnel that I went through. It's considered a 5-star tunnel because you can walk, there's electricity, Now, to drive from Jerusalem, which is where I live, to Gaza is maybe an hour and 15 minutes, maybe an hour and a half. I had to go from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, then fly from Tel Aviv to Eilat in the very south, cross the border into Egypt, drive for about 10 hours through the Sinai desert to end up in Rafah, which is the border town between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. And then wait for a couple hours to get the okay, then drive in the dark through these alleys like a movie, and then you stop at a place that's indistinguishable and whisk through this tunnel. It's about maybe a 3-4 minute walk. And at the end of this 14-hour journey, I was exactly an hour and 15 minutes away from my house in Jerusalem, where I left that morning. It's beyond absurd. It's beyond madness. And driving through Egypt, through Sinai, was a little, I have to say, was not the most reassuring thing in the world. Being back in Palestine and being in Gaza was reassuring, just to give you an idea of what it was like. And that's the reality. That's the absolutely absurd reality. But the difficulties and the reality of life for Palestinians, this is not a reality only in Gaza. Palestinians in Jerusalem, these are pictures from Jerusalem that I just randomly took. A bunch of young Palestinians being held, frisked, arrested, killed, beaten, every single day. This is the reality of Palestinians living in Jerusalem. The army presence is everywhere. It's obscene. It's obscene. And the way they treat Palestinians just walking by is obscene. This young boy, he's actually quite lucky because he's at Hadassah Hospital right there. He was shot in the leg so many times that they have to amputate his leg from the knee down. Now, until about 5 minutes before we visited him, and that's his mother there with a hijab, he was handcuffed to the bed. Now he can't walk, and they're going to amputate his leg. There's no way he can run away, but they had to handcuff this 13-year-old boy, and the claim was that he was what? A child terrorist. And even the Israeli TV, the Israeli news had a special report about this new phenomenon of child terrorists. And they went to the schools to find out how have they developed and cultivated these child terrorists. Who is a sick, crazy lunatic that could put these two words together in a sentence, child terrorist? And of course the claim is that this little boy tried to stab one of those Rambos, fully armed Rambos that patrol the city. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was shot, and this is where he is right now. Hebron. If you've been to Hebron, there's a major intersection going to Hebron. It's called the Etzion Junction, And it's a big intersection, and it's a very complicated place because it's an intersection where you have, all of the southern West Bank, which is heavily populated by Palestinians, as well as the most vicious, fanatic, violent Israeli settlers, all around that area. And so the intersection is always heavily guarded. There's lots of army presence. Now, and I took this picture just maybe a month or two ago, they've got snipers at about 10 different points around this intersection. Now the snipers are actually standing there, just like this one, with their eye on the sight and their finger on the trigger, ready to shoot. And they don't aim at people who look like me. So you can imagine what it's like for Palestinians who have to go through this intersection every day. In their country, on their land. But it doesn't end there. It doesn't end there. The prosecution and persecution of Palestinians continues in levels that are almost hard to imagine. I'm working on a book now that I'm actually about to finish about a case called the Holy Land Foundation. The Holy Land Foundation was the largest Muslim charity in America, and it was run by Palestinians. And they were brought down, closed down with charges of terrorism, and after about almost 2 decades of working on this, they managed to put 5 men in prison for very long prison sentences. And you have to wonder how they came up with this, of equating charity to Palestinians with terrorism. And you may have heard about World Vision. World Vision is a large Christian charity, and they have a branch in Gaza, and their branch manager was just accused by the Israelis of giving $40 million of charity money to Hamas, which is of course absurd, but it's creating a lot of problems for World Vision right now. And the way they do this, there's 2 aspects. One of it is the claim. What is the claim? How do you equate charity to support for terrorism? Well, one thing they do is they say, well, in the case of the Holy Land Foundation, what they said was they were giving money to orphans. They had an orphan program. And when they looked at the list of the children, you had the cause of death of the father, and the cause of death it said martyr, shaheed. The Israelis and the Americans decided that shaheed means suicide bomber. Shaheed is martyr. And in the context of Palestine and the Arab world in general, when somebody dies, just out of respect, they're called a martyr, just to give meaning to the life and the death. You don't die for nothing. And it turns out the entire list, there was not a single terrorist. But the point is this, they interpreted it as meaning the children of suicide bombers. Or at least that's how they came out. They said, look, they're supporting suicide bombers, and I'm sure you've heard this because this claim is made all the time. They're supporting suicide bombers, and they're encouraging parents to send, or they're encouraging people to go and become suicide bombers for the money that their family is going to get. Well, not to let the facts interfere with a good story, the Palestinian suicide bombers, during the period where there were suicide bombers, did not have children. None of the suicide bombers had children. The profile of a suicide bomber is precisely somebody who does not have a family and does not have children. So this is complete nonsense. But again, why let the facts interfere with a good story? They supported suicide bombers. End of story. Another program they had was to support the families of prisoners. Israel has thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners, the vast majority of whom have never been engaged in violence. So again, this is interpreted, well, if they're prisoners, then why are they prisoners? Because they're terrorists. So again, this charity is supporting the families, not only supporting, but encouraging families to engage in terrorism because they're getting all this money. And if you look at the amounts of money, the stipends that they were getting, $50 a month or something, it's absolutely absurd. Then you have to wonder, how did the system allow this nonsense to actually come to a court? And one of the lawyers that I spoke to that represented the Holy Land Foundation in the many trials that they had described it like this. He said the entire judicial system had been taken hostage. The Constitution, the laws, and government agency regulations, which are key, have been suspended. And huge amounts of pressure by Israel and the pro-Israeli groups like the ADL and others. Post 9/11 hysteria helped a lot. And he says the cowardice of the judiciary. And it's amazing to see how all three branches of government worked in such harmony that you don't see in any other area. Congress passed the laws, the president signed executive orders, and the judges convicted. And these are three men that I was actually able to visit in prison already. And if you look at the prison sentences, considering they had done nothing wrong, and this is federal prison, 15 years, 20 years, 65 years. And then there are two that I've not been able to visit. Ghassan Elashi, 65 years, and Mohammed Mazain, 15 years. For doing nothing wrong. But this thing of equating charity to Palestinian with terror, they worked on it for a very long time. It started in the mid-90s. These guys were actually convicted in around 2009. So it took a very long time, and they were successful. And by bringing down this major, the largest Muslim and a very successful and highly respected charity here in America, they were able to destroy charity to Palestinians. Money flowing to the needy, the most needy in Palestine. And of course, completely create havoc among the Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities here in America. Another lawyer said this was, the way this was handled, he said, this particular case, he said, completely unheard of in the annals of the law. And these are experienced lawyers that have been in the business for a very long time. None of them had ever seen anything like it. So that's going to be the topic. That's the subject of my next book coming up. Now there's an aspect of this question, the question of Palestine, that we must never discuss, and that's resistance. Palestinians are not allowed to engage in resistance. They're allowed to be victims, or they're allowed to be terrorists. But resistance somehow gives a sense of kind of legitimacy, because if you're resisting, maybe there's some injustice. So that is something we cannot talk about in the context of Palestine. And there's a quote from Frantz Fanon that I like to show, where he says, colonialism is not a machine capable of thinking, a body endowed with reason. It is naked violence and only gives in when confronted with greater violence. And if that doesn't describe the state of Israel, I don't know what does. And this is exactly why all these notions that there could be a peace agreement with Israel on the issue of Palestine is absolutely absurd. It's a complete misunderstanding of colonialism, and particularly Zionism, which is a unique form of colonialism. And he wasn't talking about this, he was talking about colonialism, Western colonialism in Africa and Asia. But today, we're fortunate in that we can see that there are other forms of effective resistance. And this is thanks to the experience in India, thanks to the experience of blacks in America, thanks to the South African experience, and to a large degree, thanks to the Palestinian experience over the last few decades, which shows us clearly that we can defeat colonialism through other means that are not armed resistance. And those include economic pressure, political isolation, and the two words, of course, three words which we are not permitted to say or support in the state of New York: boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS. Now, what is unique about BDS, besides being principled, effective, morally true, and the right thing to do, is that the idea for imposing boycott, divestment, and sanction on Israel came as a request from the Palestinians. Palestinian civil society came out with a call, giving all of us a roadmap on how we can help the Palestinian cause, how we can bring about justice and peace in Palestine. It is through imposing boycott, divestment, and sanctions on the state of Israel. And if we look again at the example of South Africa, in South Africa, everybody I spoke to, black, white, and brown, all said the exact same thing. BDS brought down apartheid in South Africa. Of course, it's never one thing. It's more like a Parthenon when you have several different aspects of the resistance. But BDS is a major force, and it is a major force today, which is why Israel fears it, which is why all of these states around the country are passing anti-BDS laws suddenly, which of course are a joke, pretty much, I think, unenforceable and only act to energize activists, because who wouldn't be happy to be arrested for violating this, these laws? But this is the reality, and I think it shows despair on the other side. And there's another aspect of what I believe is resistance here in the United States, particularly, and that's Students for Justice in Palestine, which are student groups on campuses who have been doing an unbelievable job in raising awareness and raising the level of conversation on Palestine here in the United States. Over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the difference in the willingness to hear and engage in this conversation on a serious level has been so dramatic. I don't think anybody could have anticipated it. Certainly not those young kids on campuses who have been doing all the hard work. And all of this, I believe, is part of the resistance, and of course there's resistance in Palestine as well. I'm almost done, and there's an important question that I feel needs to be asked. I believe that all of us here, and not just here in this room, but here in this country, who are, as they say, rich, free, and alive all at the same time, we have an obligation to find hope. We have an obligation. It is our responsibility to look closely at this issue, to find where there is hope, and then act based on that. We do not have the luxury, we do not have the right to say this is hopeless, to say this is an intractable conflict and there's nothing we can do. We do not have the right to do that, besides the fact that we give so much money to perpetuate this conflict. And the question is very simple, and I think we can really narrow it down to two choices. The first choice is the reality that we have today. Occupied Palestine with a regime that offers exclusive rights to Jewish people, which is what we know as Israel. Anybody who supports the state of Israel, partly, in whole, 10%, any variations you can imagine, has to understand that the existence of a Jewish state in Palestine will come at the expense of Palestinian rights, of the rights of the indigenous people, the Palestinians. There is no other way. It's going to come with thousands of political prisoners, because there will be resistance. It's going to come with constant murder of civilians in Gaza, like we've seen over the last 7 decades. It's going to come with human rights abuses. It's a package deal. That is what Israel, is what a Jewish state in Palestine includes. And if we support that, that's what we support. That's one option. And the question is there hope in that? Is there hope for peace and justice in that? The other option is a free, democratic Palestine with equal rights, with respect for human rights, that provides justice and freedom to everyone who lives there, in the entire country. A Palestine that is not a Jewish state, but a state of its citizens. A Palestine that has a government and a legislature that represents all the people. And the question is very simple. Where do you see hope? Wherever it is that we see hope, that is the direction we need to go. That is the option that we need to pursue. And we need to pursue it with vigor, with passion. Because we do not have the luxury to sit on the fence, and we have the duty, I believe, to act and to make sure that whichever of these options we believe in actually becomes a reality. Of course, the first one is the reality. And I'm going to leave you with this picture. And this is a picture that I took at a Palestinian refugee camp. These kids live in such unbelievably horrible conditions that none of us would be smiling if we lived there. None of us would be smiling if we spent 5 minutes there. I was there with some friends. We were all in tears. We couldn't take it. There's no way we would be smiling, but of course this is the spirit of Palestine. And these kids, this camp is less than an hour away from the very place where their grandparents were exiled. And they only live under these conditions because Israel won't allow them back. And then we need to wrap our heads around the idea of what is free Palestine. When we say free Palestine, what does that mean? Free Palestine means a Palestine that is democratic, that does not have racist laws, that does not have checkpoints, that does not have a brutal military force imposing itself on half of the population. It means people are free. All people who live there are equal. That is what a free Palestine is about. From the river to the sea, from the Galilee to the Negev Desert, the entire country, free for all the people who live there. And I believe very firmly, like I said in the beginning, that if we all do our job, and if we all embrace our responsibility to do this, then we will see a free Palestine, and we will see it much sooner than most people think. Thank you very much. Okay, well, the reality is that there is a witch hunt, and there has been actually a witch hunt. The story of, I forgot her last name, Simona
Sharina.
Yeah, she's a professor at SUNY, at one of the campuses of SUNY, and she's being harassed, like many, well, she's being harassed, and the question is, you know, what can we do about it? Conducting witch hunts is part of what the other side does in order to combat the growth of the Palestine Solidarity movement on campuses. So they have this monstrous thing called the Canary Mission. And the Canary Mission is a website, and it lists names and all the details of student activists who are mostly SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, or other, you know, groups that support the Palestinian cause, and equates their work with support for terrorism in a demonic and horrifying way that is really beyond understanding. So that's one thing that they do. The other thing they do is they go after professors that express, that support BDS, that support the academic part of the boycott. And this is just the reality of this struggle. You know, when you get into the struggle, then you're going to be subject to this kind of, you know, this kind of a witch hunt. That's kind of the way. That's just the way it is. What people can do is, of course, support these students and support these professors wherever they can. So if there's an SJP group in the local college here, in the local university, then everybody needs to support them. And the college administration needs to know that they have community support. Professors that are put in this position need to receive support. The university president needs to get letters from the community expressing your anger and the fact that this is unacceptable. Besides the fact that people have a right to support whatever they want to support, and BDS is legal and well, they're making it illegal, but it's legal, it's moral, and it's the right thing to do. People have a right to support these things. There is the thing called the First Amendment here in this country, right? So I think the thing to do is to have the community behind these people, whether they're students or their faculty, to make sure that the administration knows that they can't get away with this. And what the administrations do, they want to stay as far away from the issue as possible. So they will try to wash their hands of these issues. But from time to time they're forced, and I think they need to be forced to face these issues and to realize that the pro-Palestinian voice is not only the legitimate voice, but the right voice, and should be allowed to be heard, and penalizing students and faculty is not acceptable and will not be accepted by the community. So I think that's what needs to be done, and I think we haven't seen the end of it. I think they're going to become more rabid, they're going to become more vicious, because they are becoming more and more desperate. You know, in a conference they had in Jerusalem, and I happened to be in Jerusalem, so I went to participate, a conference that was called How to Fight the BDS. And the BDS is the title for all, you know, Palestine Solidarity. And one of the things that was said, it was a very long day with all the heavy hitters, cabinet ministers, the president of the state of Israel, Mossad people, you know, journalists. Everybody was discussing how do we combat this anti-Semitic, new anti-Semitic thing that's out there. And one of the things that they said was that the Mossad, you know, the Israeli Secret Service, had not yet pulled out all of its arsenal, has not yet used its arsenal in order to combat this, because it's like terrorism, it's like ISIS, and of course we have to get rid of it. So I don't think anybody is going to be assassinated, but I do think they're going to do everything they can short of assassination to make people's lives very difficult. And it's again up to us. It's up to us to make sure that these people who are putting themselves out there have support, and that the administration here in the US and the government of Israel know that they can't get away with this. I think this is extremely, extremely important. The percentage of Jews in Israel that think or that believe the things that I talked about is somewhere between 0 and maybe 0. I think I can count on the fingers of 2 hands the number of people who I'm exaggerating a little bit, maybe there's a couple of hundred, but very few people in Israel actually believe in this, support the idea of Palestinian rights, even think that Palestinians have rights. And the thing is, in Israel, there is no dissent, which is really unique. Israel is a democratic society for Jews. So Jews can be out in the street protesting, why are we bombing and murdering people in Gaza? Why are Palestinians not getting the water that they need, and so forth. But there is no dissent. I was there in 2014 when Israel was during the massacre of 2014 on Gaza, and there was no dissent. There was no dissent. Netanyahu had the best ratings of any prime minister ever. He was in prime minister heaven. The press, there was no dissent. Other politicians, there is no opposition. The people on the streets, poll after poll, he never had such high ratings. There is no dissent on the issue of Palestine at all.
Writers like Gideon Levy.
Yeah, so there's Gideon Levy. That's it. There's not writers like Gideon Levy. There's Gideon Levy, and there's Amir Haas, and there's Amir Haas. So these are all the same 200 people. These are all the same 200 people. You know, these are exactly all the same people that support the exact same thing in varying degrees, but it's about the same group of people, which is strange, you know, because but it's because the segregation is so deep. And Israelis live in a sphere that is so privileged and clean of Palestinians. They don't see Palestinians, they don't care about Palestinians, they don't want to know Palestinians, and they don't have to. The segregation is so deep, even though geographically, you know, the country is very small. You're never more than 10 minutes away from a Palestinian town. But because everything is so deeply segregated, as an Israeli, you don't have to, you can pretend that there is no such thing as Palestinians, and when you bring it up, they say, well, it's not our problem. Palestine is not our problem. They have to stay far away from us, and we're fine. But I think that's typical. I don't think there's ever been a privileged society that was fighting to end its privilege. You know, quite the opposite. How many whites in South Africa supported the end of apartheid? You know, they were forced towards the end, growing numbers. But in terms of percent of the population, there were some activists. But as a society, certainly white South Africans did not welcome the end of apartheid. They were forced into it. Israelis are going to change. Israelis are going to change the day after. They have to be hit on the head, brought to their knees, forced to end this racist apartheid regime that gives them privilege, and the next day they're going to see that everything's fine. They may have a Palestinian prime minister, and their kids are going to go to school with Palestinian children, and they're going to wake up the next morning and they'll see that the sky hasn't fallen. That's how it's going to work. And so typically that's the reality. That's why BDS is so important. That's why the resistance is so important. That's why fighting it and bringing it down is so important, because that's the only way change comes. It's not going to come from Israeli society. It's certainly not going to come from American politicians or any American president. It's going to only come if we force it to come, if we make it happen. But that's the reality. There is no dissent. There are a couple of very small Israeli peace groups, very small. There's a couple of, you know, dissenters, a couple of refuseniks. I mean, we're talking about very small groups of people. You know, what used to be the Israeli peace camp collapsed. And the reason it collapsed, it was because it was a lie. You cannot support Israel and claim to want peace at the same time. You cannot support a racist regime and claim that you want a free society at the same time. You have to pick sides. And on this issue, it's like racism. You're either a racist or you're not. You either support the racist regime or you oppose it. You can't say, well, we're going to oppose it, but up to here. From here, it's okay to have the racist regime, but from here to here, we're going to allow people to... It's not how... This doesn't work this way. It's a question of values. You either oppose it completely or support it completely. You know, it's polarizing, and it should be polarizing because this is an important issue. It's an issue of values, and on values, there's no compromise. People come to me sometimes and say, how can you criticize Israel, you know, at such a time? And what I say is very simple. You either agree, you either think that it's okay to drop bombs on innocent civilians and kill children, or you oppose it. It's very simple. It's as clear as daylight. I believe that if the devil himself was living in Gaza, it still wouldn't justify harming the hair on the head of a single child. Some people think it's okay to murder 2,500 people in 50 days because of Hamas, which is, by the way, a perfectly legitimate resistance organization. A perfectly legitimate resistance organization. And if they weren't Palestinians, they'd be heralded as heroes around the world. But Palestinians are not allowed to be heroes, they're only allowed to be terrorists and victims. And that's the reality. So there's a double standard here, which is very, very clear, I believe. The reason Egypt colludes with Israel and the United States is because of the foreign aid, money. Egypt, like the other Arab countries, have regimes that are supported by the United States and Israel. The Egyptians get something like $2 or $2.5 billion, majority of which goes into the pockets of the generals. Egypt is run by the army. The one attempt that they had at a democracy was destroyed. The United States, instead of supporting the democratically elected president who sits in prison now, are supporting the coup leader, this lunatic egomaniac general who is now the president of Egypt. And the deal was that they support Israel and America with everything. So the deal is actually, the siege on Gaza is a three-way agreement between Israel, the United States, and Egypt, which of course is criminal in every single way. If Egyptians had a democratically elected government, I don't think it would have been so easy for Israel to get away with it. The issue of the Jewish community, or the Jewish communities and the temples and the synagogues and the rabbis that participate in interfaith and their discomfort with the issue of Palestine, it's not an easy issue. And I hear this from people who either participate in interfaith groups or just people who have friends who are Jewish and feel the same discomfort. It is they who need to feel the discomfort. They need to be made to feel as uncomfortable as possible for supporting this atrocity. Anyone who supports the state of Israel, anyone who supports this racist, brutal regime, the murder of Palestinians, the denial of rights, the denial of water, must be made to feel uncomfortable. If they choose to leave the group, there are plenty of other Jews who can replace them. There's not one Jewish, in fact, there's no such thing as a Jewish community. The mainstream, or the so-called mainstream Jewish community, is the Zionists, the pro-Israeli groups, these big reformed temples. But there are others. There's JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace. They're just as Jewish. There are the ultra-Orthodox who oppose the state of Israel. There are plenty of Jews out there that could come in and participate in a productive discussion on other issues, as well as the issue of Palestine. If they support the state of Israel, these rabbis, I'm telling you now, as I'm standing here, will be shamed one day. They will either lie about their stance, or they will hide in some corner, ashamed of the fact that they supported Israel. And if they are made to feel uncomfortable, that's exactly how they should feel. Anyone who supports racism, anyone who supports violence, needs to feel that shame. And I would go even further and say they need to come and beg to be allowed to enter these groups, because they are not worthy if they support the state of Israel. That should be absolutely, it's a question of values. If anyone thinks, if anyone believes that what Israel is doing is even remotely okay, even remotely acceptable, they should not have a place at the table. There are some issues about which we must be very clear, and racism and brutality is one of those. And I think it's very difficult for people to do because they have personal relationships, they have long-standing relationships, they have agreements and a lot of other common issues that they can discuss. But there are certain things about which there can be no compromise. You're either a racist or you're not. You either support it or you don't. And if you do, you do. There's no gray area. There are no degrees here. And if they support the state of Israel, they should not be sitting at a table. At the table, they should not be given the right to sit at the table. They should be outside begging for forgiveness first. And once that forgiveness is given by the Palestinians, then we can consider letting them in. That is the approach we should have. I can tell you now that people who support the state of Israel and Israelis, it will take generations before they can fully accommodate and fully pay for the crimes they have committed against Palestinians. It would take generations. They could pay all the money in the world, and still it wouldn't be enough to fully pay for their crimes. And those who are complicit are just as criminal, because they're allowing this to happen, and they make people who are good people, like the interfaith people, the Christians and others, feel guilty for not supporting them, where it should be the other way around. There is no room for weakness here. There is no room for compromise, I believe. What I said in the beginning is that unless we oppose these things, unless we oppose the policies regarding Palestine, unless we oppose the policies regarding Iraq and so forth, actively, then we are complicit. You know, so if you're part of a group, if your action as an individual or as part of a group that is opposing them, then you are opposing them. You know, that's the reality. But I absolutely agree with you that people who do not stand in clear opposition to these crimes in Iraq and in Syria and in Yemen, which is a proxy war, and all these other places, and of course in Palestine, they are complicit. But I would dare to guess that I think that you particularly are probably opposed to these things, the way you express yourself, whereas they are not. They might be opposed to Iraq, but they're not opposed to it in Palestine. So, like I said, you either accept brutality, colonialism, and racism, or you reject it. You can't say, well, it's okay here because here we have a special case because of the Holocaust or because of something, you know? It's an excuse. It's not acceptable. If we reject it, we reject it. And like I said, I know it's not an easy thing, and I know this is not an easy answer to hear, but I absolutely believe that this is the right thing to do, and this is the approach. The issue of the internationals that are observers and come to support the Palestinians is extremely important. The role of internationals to come to Palestine, whether it's the ecumenical accompaniment program or any other programs that are out there, are extremely important. They make all the difference in the world sometimes between children being beaten and tortured by settlers and by soldiers and not, and people being kicked off their land and not. Which is why now, and if you participate in any of these, you know, they have to lie when they come through the border. In other words, the kindest, gentlest, most generous people who are giving their money and their time and their effort to go and support Palestinians who are oppressed, they are the enemy, and they have to be careful at the border when they come to Israel. It's either young people like the International Solidarity Movement, or sometimes, usually it's older people that come with their churches. These are the enemy. These are the people that Israel is looking for to deport. How sick is that? How sick of a regime is that, where they take the kindest, most non-violent, most accommodating people, and they are the enemy. They are the ones they're looking for. They're looking at the list to see if you belong to this church or that church or this group or that group, because they know you're going to stand there and witness their crimes. If nothing else, this should tell us how corrupt and violent and horrifying the state of Israel is, because you are the enemy. Can you imagine how horrible it is? I think their role is extremely important. I think they should be sent in the plane loads, and then not lie. I know that when you come as a small group of 8 or 10 or something, you don't have a choice. I was there one time, and the ecumenical accompaniment, they come in groups, and one group replaces the other. So I forget how many in the group, and they all lied their way through, but one of the members was not a good liar, and she was caught. They brought the entire group back and sent them away. Sent them back to, I think they came from Norway, which meant the other group that was there had to stay for another couple of months, couldn't be replaced. This is absurd. This is absurd. The nicest, kindest people who wouldn't hurt a fly, who are there to help people who are in real danger, they are the enemy. They are the ones that are trying to keep away. These people should have a red carpet when they come in and be given flowers and five-star treatment. That is the reality of Israel. That, if nothing else, that should tell everybody what a horrible, horrible regime this is, and that we need to get rid of it as soon as humanly possible. And they make a big difference. In Hebron, especially in the more the places where the tensions are higher, they make a huge difference, and where you have these settlements around Nablus and other places. Absolutely. When my book came out, the book came out in the spring of 2012, and immediately I became a full-time speaker. I started getting requests, and it's been 5 years, and I'm still doing this full-time. So, and it's given me an opportunity to meet the nicest, kindest, smartest people in the world, here in the United States and overseas. It's been absolutely wonderful experience, and it continues to be that way. So I can't come up and say, oh yes, you know, it's a terrible sacrifice, what I've been through. Nothing at all. I've made lots of new friends, and this is work that I enjoy every minute of. So there have not been any negative repercussions at all. And the thing is also, the repercussions, if there are ever any, are very small for Israeli Jews. If I was a Palestinian, then it would be very different, you know. I go in and out, I go to visit, I'm there all the time, in and out. I have no problem in the border, I have no problem anywhere. I mean, I have been arrested, but that's at protests in the West Bank where I'm trying to cause as much trouble as I can. But not because anything I do outside of there. In terms of social media, and what happens on social media, this is something that I thought more people knew, but I guess they don't. Stand With Us, particularly, which has, have very deep pockets, okay? Have full-time staff on social media to do all kinds of crazy stuff. All kinds of crazy stuff. They've got all kinds of strategies. At that conference, How to Fight the BDS, they had a breakout session with the Stand With Us people for young, social media types on how to combat this on BDS and on social media. And that's exactly what they were talking about. And they have a full-time paid staff sitting all day, every day. That's their job, to go on social media and interrupt the Palestine solidarity work. So if you see anything that's kind of funny, that's probably what it is. And they've got lots of different strategies on how they do this. They either, I won't get into it, but if you see something funny going on, you block the person, you move on, because they do have they have an enormous budget, and people who are paid full time to do this. You can hold an event, put out a flyer, and whoever comes, comes. If you want to allow KKK people to come to your event, that's up to you. Perhaps there'll be a change. But I wouldn't go to the KKK chapter and ask them to come. They are the KKK people. They may be Jewish and liberal on other issues and look like us, and they don't have the white sheets. They are KKK people. They are the white supremacists. They are the apartheid South Africans. That's who they represent. For some reason, on other issues, they manage to portray this very liberal, very friendly on all other issues, liberal issues, and maybe even progressive issues, but not on this issue. They are special. That's who they are. So, of course, if you want to include, everybody can include whoever they want. I personally feel that for them to come to the table, they need to be held accountable first. And this is a struggle where, like I said, me being white, Jewish, Israeli, American, there are very little repercussions. I show up, and the way I look and the way I talk is very easy for me. If I was Palestinian, if I was brown, if I was black, it would be a completely different story. An entirely different story, and I think we know this. For people who are Palestinians, who do what I do, whose skin is brown and perhaps have an accent, it is an entirely different world. They're in a foxhole, and they need to know who is next to them in the foxhole. And if it's a KKK person, then that's dangerous, And they get all kinds of horrible things done to them on social media. And they get threatened, and they get hate mail and death threats and all kinds of problems. And when they go into the airport, they get held for hours here in the United States. It is a completely different experience to do what I do as a Palestinian. So it's very easy for us to say, yes, we need to include these people. You know what? If they want to come, and if you want to include them, that's fine. But you need to I think it needs to be clear that on this issue, they are the KKK people, they are the apartheid people, and we need to decide if we want them. And I think before they're welcome to the table, they need to atone for some of their crimes. But again, this is me, and if you do get one or two or three that want to change, then that's different. But it happens in very small numbers. In terms of the rockets and suicide bombing was an episode that lasted a certain period of time and ended. Palestinians did it for a while, and they decided to stop. And we can talk about that, but I won't get into it. It's a long story, but they decided to stop, okay? The rockets, are part of the Palestinian resistance in Gaza. Now, I want to see how many of us would would live in Gaza and not support shooting rockets? I want to know how many of us suffer what Palestinians suffer and not be willing to die in the process of fighting to liberate our country, even if it means killing civilians. I want to know, because it's very easy for us as white privileged people to stand here and criticize the oppressed for their choices of resistance. It's not for us. I want to see how many of those people would be in the same place and not act the same way. If Israel does not want resistance, Israel needs to stop the oppression. Period. The Palestinian resistance, all different types of Palestinian resistance, we may personally like them or not like them, they are legitimate and they are legal. If you look at international law, armed resistance against an occupation is legal. Armed resistance against oppression is legal as defined by international law. Look at United Nations resolutions about the rights of people to fight and struggle against oppression and occupation. Armed resistance is considered completely legal. We may prefer other types of resistance, but we have the luxury. As it happens in the case of Palestine, the vast majority of Palestinian resistance over the last 7 decades has been unarmed resistance. But nobody knows, nobody talks about this because the armed resistance is sexier and it makes the news. Never mind, there hasn't been armed resistance in a very long time. But I want to see how many of us would live in Gaza and not start shooting rockets. And when the Israeli, in 2014 and other times as well, but particularly in 2014, Israel put in thousands of ground troops into this small place in this Gaza, okay? And young Palestinians fought heroically on the ground against them. And the Israeli army had too many casualties to a point where it became a PR problem, so they started to withdraw. And these Palestinians gave their lives for this. And if they were not Palestinians, we would all call them heroes, we would know them by name. Same as the Palestinian hunger strikers. Nobody knows they're Palestinian hunger strikers. Giving up, it is the ultimate sacrifice, to die in the most painful, self-inflicted way. And what are they asking for? The end of the unjust practice of administrative detention. Nobody knows about them, nobody talks about them. 50 days, 60 days, 70, 80 days of hunger strike. One internal system after the other, shutting down, to a point where many of it, where it's, a lot of it is irreversible. Thankfully, none of them have died yet, because Israel knows exactly when to stop and when to negotiate. But they go through excruciating pain. So it's very easy for us to say, well, we don't like rockets. Well, if we don't like rockets, we need to support the Palestinian cause, we need to support the BDS movement, we need to support the Palestinian the popular resistance, and we need to make sure that Israel is transformed into a real democracy with equal rights. That is the problem. The problem is not the resistance. People are always looking at the victim and saying, well, why are they behaving badly? It's very easy for us, but I think it's wrong, and I think that's the answer. That is the only answer. It's a question of values. We either support it or we don't. And again, with us, without us, some issues are like that. Some issues are polarizing, and they should be polarizing. There is no common ground when we talk about racism. There is no gray area. I have a friend, a great Jewish JVP activist in San Diego, Ed Swede. He says, I oppose racism. What's your opinion? It's as simple as that. That's what it's about. You know, so with us, against us, but they are the ones who are placing themselves on the outside. It's not we that are doing the wrong thing, that we need to apologize for being, for opposing the oppression, opposing this. They should be ashamed of not opposing it. What kind of values do they have? What kind of nonsense is this? You know, so yes, there's the issue of the rockets, there's the issue of we're Palestinians, unified people. Well, if you talk to Palestinians, they've been a unified people for a very long time. And if you read my book, you'll see that Israel has never been under an existential threat. Except for the 1973 war, Israel had initiated every single one of the wars, of the conflicts. And particularly I talk about the 67 war because Israel, you know, the claim is that Israel was under an existential threat and had no choice but to start the preemptive strike. And you look at and I have it in the book, I have the minutes of the meetings of the generals of the Israeli High Command, of which my dad was a member. the minutes of the meetings leading up to the war. And they're saying, look, we have a tremendous opportunity now to destroy them again. This idea that Israel is an existential threat is a joke. And they say this, that the Egyptian army is, and all the intelligence reports, which they had and which I talk about in the book, the Egyptian army, which is really the only serious army, all the other armies were small and ineffective, needed at least 2 years from that point in order to be prepared for war. It was not prepared for war, and they were saying, why are they doing this? Don't they know we're going to destroy them? And they did in 6 days. They decimated 3 armies in 6 days. That was an existential threat. You know, they make it sound as though, you know, once again, David and Goliath, you know, divine intervention. They knew it was going to be a walk in the park, and it wasn't a walk in the park, and they killed 18,000 soldiers, Arab soldiers, at a loss of 700 Israeli soldiers. There was an existential threat here, but for whom? 18,000 versus 700 in 6 days. It's absurd. The claims of an existential threat are completely false from start to finish. So again, they come up with all this nonsense, and then when they're done with that, then they come with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. You know? And when people start calling you names, you know the argument's over. They've got nothing more to say. And now they're at a point where they don't even try to argue, they go straight to the name calling of anti-Semitism. Well, if name calling is all you've got, stay home. It's not even worth the conversation, not even worth replying to the anti-Semitism stuff, because it's such nonsense. Anyway, I think we're good. Thank you all very much.
I'd like to thank you.